Hi everyone. It is amazing to be in the same room with many of people whose work I've followed for years and who I deeply admire. Thank you to Amanda for the very lovely introduction. So again, I'm Bianchi. I'm representing the team at Continentalist. And although they're not here with me physically, some of them are probably on the live stream here with me in spirit. I'm going to talk about Cities of Desire, Building a Woman's World, and I'm going to try and keep it very casual because this work is a very deeply personal work for many of us. But first, I'm going to introduce Continentalist. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, we are a data storytelling and editorial studio based in Singapore. Some of us are scattered throughout the world. I'm here. Some people are in Dubai, some people are in Indonesia, and some people are in Manila. We help people understand Asia through visualizing data, cutting through the noise, bridging research and public. And we've done a lot of different types of stories. We focus on things like social justice, culture, environmental change, and in this work, cities. And if it's not obvious by now, I really love cities, and that has colored some of what we've done here with A Woman's World. We are a very flat structure, but one thing that we do have is that we mix editorial, design, and development. So as Amanda mentioned, I'm in the development team, but also not really. I kind of straddle that bridge between editorial and development in that I know how to code enough that I can build prototypes, but when it comes to production, I leave that in the capable hands of Aisha. Shout out to Aisha, who built the Women's World story. I would also like to shout out to Amanda, who was the main designer for this, and also Gris, who was the illustrator for A Woman's World. So I think it's very important for me to center why we do what we do. Many Asian countries rank low on the Global Open Data Index, and I mean, from the time I've spent already at MIT, there's a lot of questions we have to ask about what open data indexes actually do. There's a poor freedom of information legislation across the region, so there's very little incentive for governments to make their data publicly available. And there's just generally a lack of publicly accessible data about the region. And in many cases, with the stories that we tell at Continentalist, the data doesn't even exist. So for an example, we did a story before on how Chinese companies have invested into Lao companies and are kind of using them as a way to influence the work that's being done in the region. But there's no central data resource for that, so you'd have to collect the data yourselves. And in the case of this work that I'm talking about today, how do you even begin to talk about what it means to be a woman in a city and to access leisure? How do you even begin to talk about what is the effect of that on your mental health, on your physical health, on how you navigate the world? So a lot of what Continentalist does is to use data, storytelling, graphics, interactive data visualization to bring data to light in an accessible manner. And we also partner with cause-driven organizations as a result of this. A lot of our work centers on working with research institutions, nonprofits, citizen advocacy, civic groups to bring the research that they have thoughtfully done, put a lot of time, work, and love into, and to communicate it to an audience in the best possible way, be it through desktop, mobile, print, or web design. And that means that sometimes we have to tell very difficult, serious stories. So this is an example from last year. I believe this is the Desperate Journeys of Rohingya Refugees story, which was also featured last year in IIB. A lot of our work, like I would say maybe 80 to 90% of the process is really about data and research. And a big part of that is providing the correct context and exercising sensitivity. And sometimes exercising sensitivity means you don't show the faces of the people you've interviewed, but you feature them as illustrations instead, because that evokes imagination in a different way than a picture of a person would. Sometimes that also means we include audio from the interviews that we've done with the people we've worked with. And again, I mean, I think I don't really need to talk about this in a room full of data storytellers, but it's good to remember that stories bring the data home and stories make data stick, and there are multiple ways to tell stories. I really love what one of the talks before me talked about in terms of learning on in how what strategies work when you're trying to teach data to kids, and a lot of that has to do with storytelling and with spending time with people telling stories about the data that you're using. In the case of our work, we use a lot of multimedia assets to create an immersive reading experience. And one thing that I want to highlight here that I'll come back to later is ending with a call to action in most, if not all, our stories. And this call to action may take many different forms. For me, it meant I went and I'm getting a master's in city planning, and I'll tie that into how this story was made. So now for the story itself. So the entire title of the work is called A Woman's World, Creating Spaces for Joy, Leisure, and Resistance in South and Southeast Asia. And because this is a day of inspiration, I want to start by talking about where does inspiration come from. I grew up in the Philippines in Quezon City. That's the picture over there on the leftmost, I think. Stage right, your left. And this is Katipunan Avenue. It's right across from where I live. And for anyone that has been in traffic in the US, you don't know traffic until you get to the Philippines. And you don't know what it's like to walk on a sidewalk until you get to the Philippines, basically. And as a woman, that understanding of risk and danger is doubly fraught just by existing in the outside world and being perceived as a woman. I don't even need to go into the details. I think most of the people in this room know. But there are other things that kind of inspired this piece. So I've got an image here from Mariam Haider, who was the main writer for this piece, and also a restaurant in Solo in Indonesia. This is credited to Kota Kita, who was one of the groups we worked with for this data story, which is that certain spaces invite anonymity and certain spaces invite community and conversation. But what are the features of these kinds of spaces, and how do they create this sense of leisure, of not having to adhere to ideas of work or education as the only reasons you can go out and be out in public? So a lot of that has to do with how cities are intentionally or unconsciously designed, and a lot of that has to do with who is designing our cities. And in the case of Katipunan, I'm not sure if anyone designed it at all. So how does that get us to how we created A Woman's World? It was clear to us from the beginning that we had to talk to women who were experiencing these spaces, not just the public, but also the semi-public and the private. And one of the key partners for this piece was a group, the Kabar Laharia, which are a digital news organization that is based out of India in the Bundelkhand region. So for those of you who don't know, Kabar Laharia is an all-female, mostly Dalit caste organization of women who have been trained as journalists. And they were one of the key partners when we were creating A Woman's World. And they spoke about their experiences as women going out into public, and also perceptions around how they are to spend their time off in that part of India. So a lot of what we did here was about crowdsourcing. We engaged 12 organizations, over 170 individuals in more than 10 cities across South and Southeast Asia. I think we hit like 5 countries. And we asked them, what does leisure look like for you? Where do you spend your leisure time? And created A Woman's World. And one thing that we learned, and I think that we draw a lot of inspiration from when we spoke to them, was that there really was a strength in numbers. And that strength in numbers was not just because, there's just a lot of us telling the same story, but it just goes to show that this is actually a problem, right? A problem in that it's not talked about, in that it's assumed that when you're on your day off, you're going to do chores, and everyone else gets to go and have fun. It's assumed that you're not supposed to be out in public space, and you should make allowances for that, that if something happens to you, that, well, maybe it's your fault. And it's really, how would I say this? For someone who had been wondering about this question for a long time, and many of the members of our team had actually kind of started to think about it as well, right? We saw this divide in a way that we had not seen before. So Griselda, the illustrator on this project, and I had a conversation about what it meant that we could only go to school or to work, and then everywhere else we just get questioned endlessly by friends and family. What time are you coming home? Or what are you wearing? How are you getting there? How are you coming back? And meanwhile, the people who had grown up in Singapore, some of our very dear colleagues, they had never asked this question. So it became this space for coming together and asking this question as a team. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that we really asked for a lot of help from different people. We asked for help from Kabarlaharia, we asked for help from Kota Kita, which is a participatory design organization based out of Solo, Indonesia. We asked for help from Sunday Nudes, which is a figure drawing group that is based in Manila. Actually, this photo here is from the focus group discussion we did with them. And the fact that we were all coming from these different cities and places with similar contexts, but not too similar that you ended up saying the same thing again and again, slight differences. It provided a richer data set, and we really pulled a lot of inspiration from that when we were creating the visuals of the story, as well as deciding on what we wanted to include. And how did we go from interviews to data? I think that here I'd like to talk a bit about what we consider as damage-centered narratives versus desire-centered narratives. And this is a concept that I encountered recently in a paper by Eve Tuck. There are many reports out there that talk about women, or well, just generally any minoritized group, as victims of systems, or maybe of a particular concerted effort to keep them victimized. But what if we started talking about desire, cities of desire? What do we wish our cities could be like? And what are these common threads across individual stories that we can create personas for? It's a very designerly term, I realize, but what do we wish our cities could become? And one thing that we did here was that we grouped statements and identified features to visualize and illustrate. So things like, I wish there were more bus stops that were well lit. I wish there were more regular bus rides. I wish that there were playgrounds where I could just sit with my friends at night and talk. I wish that there was more equal division of labor in the household. What could our cities look like from a place of desire rather than from a place of damage? And this is something that our editor-in-chief, Nabila, I think was a key person in identifying. Originally, the story was, we had discussions with a group of people around cycling. We were very interested in what cycling was doing to kind of improve how people were accessing public space. And then we realized, wait, cycling's not the only way people access public space, right? And a public space can also kind of be a private space, but you invite people in. It's really not about the infrastructure sometimes. It's about the community that you're with and the kind of culture that you're creating. And so this was, how would I say this? To see this illustrated, I think, brought some of us to tears. I know it brought me to tears, right? Because we were not talking about ourselves as people who have been damaged by the city. We were talking about what we wished and desired from the city, if we could create such a city. And there's still ways to talk about qualitative data in a work like this, right? So you show broad trends in the data. These were statements from the interviews that we coded, and we showed how they were occurring across physical, economic, and social aspects. And again, we go back to this idea of desire. We show not only problems, but also solutions so that others may learn. So we feature all of the organizations that we spoke to for this piece and talk about the work that they're already doing to create these kinds of safe and inclusive spaces that are not just in the private spaces, but also in public spaces. So what are some principles of working with communities in data-driven stories? And I want to talk about this from a point of inspiration, that it is possible to do this kind of broad, multi-country, multi-city research. Is a lot of it has to do with listening to the community. I came in with ideas about cycling being the way to increasing access to public space from the perspective of leisure, and I was pleasantly surprised to realize that, yeah, it was one part of it, but there were many other ways too that had to do with hobbies, that had to do with phones, and us being able to meet people in online spaces, that had to do with basic things like accessibility and ramps. A lot of what the work that we do in Continentalist is about creating stories that are context sensitive, that are created with a very deep sense of knowing what parts of Asia are like, rather than as someone coming in. And the last thing I want to emphasize here is finding things to celebrate amidst challenges. So I'm going to go back to this, and I'm just going to go back to this idea of a call to action. The call to action for this story was not something that, how would I say this, was super clear, in that we wanted you to get out and take a bike, maybe. But I know for some of us ended up learning up how to bike because of this story, which is, I think, quite empowering. But the call to action is a bit more of a personal sense of what does it mean to be someone who accesses public spaces for leisure, and how does the design of the city affect that? And for me, my personal call to action was I am now doing a Master's of City Planning because this story made me want to go out and make a change in the world. Anyways, thank you for listening. We have more resources about Continentalists if you want to find out more about the work that we do. We do a lot of education work, we do workshops, and you can find us at all these different platforms, although I think, yeah, that shouldn't be a bird, that should be X. Thank you, everyone.